Mick Mars and Mötley Crüe, Part 1. At 74, Mick Mars has utterly shocked fans about Mötley Crüe, all the behind-the-scenes stuff. Best known as the co-founder and lead guitarist of Mötley Crüe, Mars, born Robert Allen Deal in 1951, has recently been pulled back into headlines as long-simmering tensions, health struggles, and legal battles reshape how fans interpret his legacy. What makes it even more striking is the contrast. A musician who spent decades standing in the background of chaos is now at the center of the loudest conversations surrounding the band he helped build. This is Mötley Crüe, as you've never seen before. The silent architect of a rock empire, Robert Allen Deal, was born in 1951. And long before the world would know him as Mick Mars, his life already carried the weight of ankylosing spondylitis. This chronic inflammatory disease attacks the spine and gradually reduces mobility. It is not a sudden disruption, but a slow tightening force, fusing vertebrae over time. For Mars, it meant pain was a constant companion long before fame. By the time he reached adulthood, the condition had already begun to define his physical presence. He stood slightly rigid, movements measured, but he never stepped away from music. Instead, he moved through California's club circuit during the 1970s. Mars spent nearly 2 decades in shifting lineups and obscure groups, including acts like Whitehorse and other short-lived projects that never reached mainstream recognition. These were years of repetition, but they shaped something critical, a disciplined, almost surgical approach to guitar tone. Mars developed a dark, blues-rooted guitar sound, heavy on sustain and layered distortion, shaped by physical limitation as much as creative choice. He was not a flamboyant player in the traditional sense of late 70s rock excess. Instead, his style carried weight, density, and control. In 1981, that shift became concrete when Mars co-founded Mötley Crüe alongside Nikki Sixx, Tommy Lee, and later Vince Neil. The band formed in Los Angeles, California, at a time when the Sunset Strip was saturated with emerging hard rock acts fighting for attention. While the other members leaned into visual chaos, theatrical personas, and rapidly building media presence, Mars anchored the band musically and even played a role in shaping its identity, including contributing to the name Mötley Crüe, which was inspired by a phrase describing a motley-looking crew seen in earlier band discussions. As Mötley Crüe began to record and perform, Mars' role became increasingly defined in the studio rather than on-stage spectacle. His guitar work formed the foundation of early recordings that would later define glam metal's commercial explosion. When Too Fast for Love was released in 1981, it introduced a raw, aggressive sound that reflected both the band's chaotic energy and Mars' grounded musical structure. What followed over the next decade was a rapid escalation. Albums like Shout at the Devil in 1983, Theater of Pain in 1985, and Dr. Feelgood in 1989 pushed the band into global recognition, selling tens of millions of records worldwide. However, Mars remained the least visible member of the group, but the body that could no longer follow the stage by the time Mötley Crüe had already cemented their status as global rock heavyweights. The physical reality behind the guitarist's silhouette was becoming increasingly difficult to ignore. Mick Mars had been living with ankylosing spondylitis. Through the 1980s and 1990s, Mars pushed through the illness while Mötley Crüe toured extensively across North America, Europe, and Japan, performing in arenas filled with tens of thousands of fans. The physical strain of repeated travel, long flights, late-night shows, rapid stage setups, and back-to-back tour legs compounded the underlying condition. You see, ankylosing spondylitis progresses with time, and for Mars, the spine's gradual loss of flexibility meant that even basic movement on stage required careful adaptation. By the early 2000s, medical intervention became unavoidable. In 2004, Mars underwent major spinal surgery that included the implantation of metal hardware designed to stabilize his spine. This procedure was not cosmetic or minor. The surgery marked a turning point, allowing him to continue performing but under increasingly controlled physical limitations. Post-surgery, he required constant pain management and adjusted posture, often performing while standing in a fixed position rather than moving freely across the stage like his bandmates. Despite these constraints, Mars continued touring with Mötley Crüe for years afterward. contributing to major reunion tours and festival circuits that drew massive global audiences in the 2000s and 2010s. These tours were physically demanding even for healthy performers, often involving multi-hour shows, repeated soundchecks, and compressed travel schedules between cities and countries. For Mars, each performance required managing pain thresholds in real time while maintaining technical precision on guitar. As the 2010s progressed, the cumulative strain began to intensify. Ankylosing spondylitis is a degenerative condition, and over time, spinal rigidity and joint inflammation can increase fatigue and reduce endurance. Mars' mobility became more restricted, with visible difficulty in movement compared to earlier decades. While he remained capable of delivering guitar parts with accuracy, the physical toll of sustained touring began to overshadow the experience of performance itself. During this period, Mötley Crüe also operated in a drastically different touring environment compared to their peak years. Production scales were larger, schedules more compressed, and expectations for high-energy performances remained unchanged despite the aging of its members. The contrast between the demands of modern arena rock touring and Mars' medical reality created a growing imbalance that could no longer be ignored internally. Eventually, the cost of sustaining that pace became unsustainable. After decades of managing a chronic spinal condition through surgery, therapy, and adaptation, Mars reached a breaking point. The breaking point, October 2022, marked a decisive fracture point in the long-running story of Mötley Crüe. Mick Mars officially announced that he would no longer tour with the group. The decision was tied directly to the progression of his ankylosing spondylitis. After years of adapting to pain, reduced mobility, and physically restrictive stage conditions, the demands of global touring finally exceeded what his body could sustain. The announcement did not dissolve his connection to the band entirely. Mars clarified that his retirement applied specifically to touring and live performances, not necessarily his status within the group's broader business and legacy structure. This distinction mattered because Mötley Crüe was not just a touring act, but also a long-established commercial entity built on catalog ownership, branding, and decades of recorded material. Almost immediately after his retirement became public, the band confirmed that guitarist John Five, born John William Lowery, known for his work with Marilyn Manson and Rob Zombie, would step in as the touring replacement. His appointment was announced ahead of major international commitments, including stadium-scale shows that continued Mötley Crüe's global touring resurgence alongside Def Leppard in their co-headlining circuit. This transition ensured that the band's live infrastructure would remain operational without interruption. For the first time in the band's four-decade history, Mötley Crüe was performing major tours without its original guitarist. Since their formation in 1981, Mars had been the sole consistent instrumental backbone through every studio era, lineup shift, breakup, and reunion. Industry observers and fans reacted immediately, framing the moment in contrasting ways. On one hand, it was viewed as an inevitable outcome of health realities that had been visible for years, particularly given Mars' documented spinal condition and reduced mobility in later performances. On the other hand, it triggered broader discussion about legacy bands transitioning into new configurations where founding members gradually step back while the brand continues to operate at full commercial scale. But for Mick Mars, troubles were not over just yet. Legal war and the fight for legacy. In early 2023, Mick Mars, who had been essentially sidelined from the band's business structure and legacy control, filed a lawsuit against his former co-stars. The lawsuit, filed in Los Angeles County Superior Court in April 2023, centered on allegations that Mars had been significantly reduced in both financial participation and decision-making authority within the band's corporate framework. At the core of the dispute was the question of profit distribution, specifically whether his ownership stake and royalty share had been altered without his full consent. Mars asserted that he remained a key stakeholder in the Mötley Crüe entity and argued that changes to his financial position were implemented unilaterally following his decision to step away from touring. Mars also challenged how decisions were made regarding the band's business operations, including touring arrangements, branding usage, and contractual negotiations tied to live performances. His position was that stepping back from the stage did not equate to relinquishing his role in the underlying structure of the band. After all, He helped create the band in 1981. This distinction became central to the legal argument: performance participation versus ownership rights. Mötley Crüe's response was immediate and forceful. The remaining members denied any wrongdoing and framed Mars' reduced touring capability as a necessary factor in restructuring the live lineup. Their position emphasized his declining physical ability due to ankylosing spondylitis, a degenerative spinal condition that had required major surgery in 2004 and had increasingly limited his mobility in later years. The band maintained that adjustments to touring and business arrangements were made in line with operational necessity rather than exclusionary intent. As filings and counterstatements became public, the dispute rapidly expanded beyond private legal disagreement and into a widely reported entertainment industry conflict. Major outlets such as Rolling Stone, Billboard, and Variety covered the case closely, with attention focusing on the contrast between Mars' role as a founding creative force and the band's assertion of functional limitations in live performance contexts. What turned this dispute into something larger than a band disagreement is how the law treats partnerships like Mötley Crüe. In situations like this, courts don't look at image or legacy. They look at contracts, ownership percentages, and fiduciary duty. If a member like Mick Mars holds a defined stake in the band's corporate entity, that stake typically cannot be reduced or altered without clear contractual provisions or consent. U.S. partnership and corporate law, especially under California jurisdiction, where the lawsuit was filed, places strict obligations on co-owners not to unilaterally dilute another partner's share or exclude them from decision-making if they still legally retain ownership. The key legal distinction in Mars' case was this: stepping back from touring does not automatically terminate ownership rights unless explicitly stated in prior agreements. Mars' 2023 lawsuit in Los Angeles County Superior Court alleged exactly that breach, claiming his ownership share had been reduced and his voting power sidelined without proper authorization. The band countered by arguing that operational realities had changed, pointing to Mars' declining ability to perform live as justification for restructuring touring and related revenue streams. This is where cases like this often hinge. If revenue is tied primarily to live performance, the argument for restructuring becomes stronger. If it's tied to catalog, branding, and legacy ownership, then exclusion becomes legally more difficult to justify. The lawsuit never reached a dramatic courtroom verdict. Instead, by 2024, both sides reached a private settlement, closing the case without publicly disclosing financial terms, revised ownership stakes, or governance changes. This is common in high-profile entertainment disputes, where prolonged litigation risks exposing internal financial structures and contracts that both sides prefer to keep confidential. Reactions from within the rock and media world lean noticeably in Mars' favor, especially among veteran musicians and industry commentators. Dee Snider publicly criticized the situation, calling it a sad way to treat a founding member, while guitarist Tracy Guns described the move as a business decision that doesn't sit right with fans. Radio host Eddie Trunk was more direct, stating that Mars was the most musically consistent guy in that band, and questioning how a founding member could be pushed aside in that manner. But to truly understand why the lawsuit struck such a nerve, you have to look at Mötley Crüe's internal history. By the mid-1980s, Mötley Crüe had already crossed into global dominance, but internally, the structure holding it together was under constant strain. In December 1987, Nikki Sixx overdosed in Los Angeles. Emergency responders even declared him clinically dead for approximately 2 minutes before reviving him with adrenaline injections. The incident was not just a personal crisis. It was a symbol of the band's trajectory at the time. Sixx himself later described the period as a complete loss of control. At the same time, Tommy Lee's legal issues and high-profile relationships kept him in constant media circulation, often overshadowing the band's musical output. Arrests, public altercations, and tabloid coverage created a cycle where attention shifted away from the band's work and toward its offstage behavior. The most serious legal and moral crisis, however, dates back to December 8, 1984. Vince Neil was driving under the influence in Redondo Beach, California, when his car collided with another vehicle, resulting in the death of Nicholas Razzle Dingley. Neil was later charged and served jail time, along with probation and financial restitution. The incident left a lasting mark not only on the band's public image, but also on its internal dynamics. It introduced a level of gravity that went beyond typical rock and roll excess, forcing the band to confront major consequences. Amid that chaos, Mick Mars functioned as the least volatile and most consistent presence. While the others cycled through addiction, legal trouble, and public breakdowns, Mars remained largely absent from those headlines. During recording sessions, particularly in the late 1980s, producers and engineers noted that Mars was often the only member consistently prepared to track parts. When the band entered rehab collectively before recording Dr. Feelgood in 1989, it marked the first time all four members were sober during production, and the result was their most commercially successful album, selling over 6 million copies in the US alone. Mars' tight, controlled guitar work became the backbone of that record, anchoring a band that had previously struggled to function cohesively in the studio. The instability didn't disappear in the 1990s. In 1992, Vince Neil was fired following internal disputes over commitment and performance, forcing the band into a risky transition. They brought in John Corabi and released a self-titled album in 1994, which, despite critical praise, failed to match the commercial success of earlier releases. This period exposed a deeper issue. Without its classic lineup, the band's identity fractured. Mars, however, remained through the transition, continuing to shape the band's sound even as its commercial footing weakened. By 1997, Neil returned, effectively restoring the original lineup, but the reunion did not erase years of accumulated tension. Behind the scenes, contractual disagreements and financial disputes were just as persistent as personal conflicts. Touring revenue, publishing rights, and branding decisions became recurring points of friction, especially as the band's legacy catalog grew in value. Their 2001 autobiography, The Dirt, laid much of this history bare, detailing not only the excess but also the internal breakdowns that nearly ended the band multiple times. The book later became the basis for the 2019 Netflix adaptation.